I've just taken a big step, perhaps the biggest step I've taken in my investing journey so far. And it's honestly probably going to have a huge impact on this channel and the content you're going to see. It was a very difficult decision that I've been contemplating for some time and one I didn't take lightly whatsoever. I've decided to sell all of my stocks.
What?
I want to explain how I got to this decision and explain my reasoning for doing this, as well as my plans going forward. And I'd like to get your guys' input on what you think I should do. And for those of you who stick around to the end and share your comments, thank you in advance. Now, before we dive into this, I want to give a quick disclaimer, because a lot of you are probably thinking, but you've only just started your new investing portfolio. And that's true, I'll still be doing that. The next episode is coming out shortly, and I'm keen to keep that going because I find it a lot of fun to make. But bear in mind, with the value of that portfolio, I'm in a fortunate position where it's not really going to affect me that much either way. Sure, it will be nice to build that up to a nice figure, which I will reveal in the next episode, but in its current form, that makes up about 0.5% of my portfolio. So it's not going to have life-changing implications. What I'm referring to is my ISA. For those of you who have seen my previous portfolio updates, you'll remember I had large positions in my ISA, particularly in companies like Taylor Wimpey and Aviva, as well as holding quite a large stake in the FTSE 100. Between the three of these, I was holding roughly £60,000 to £70,000. And while they're both paying very chunky dividends this year of around 8%, neither have performed particularly well this year, which pretty much offsets the dividend I would receive anyway. Of course, they could choose to cut those dividends as well if things aren't going particularly well. I'm not saying they will, but there's always a possibility. Certain factors have arisen, like the state of the property market, and some of you may believe that's factored into the current price or not, but honestly, my decision isn't even a reflection of how I see these companies are performing or where they're going to go, because long term I think they're still pretty good viable options. But that does bring me on to one of the points that made me sell and change up my strategy, which was, do I really have faith in the UK? Now, I don't think it's any huge secret that when we look at the different indexes, the UK definitely hasn't seen the explosive growth that we've seen elsewhere in the world. And weirdly, this is a bit more complex than you think, and it's actually split into two separate issues. The first is with the FTSE 100, which I had a huge amount of money in. I think it was roughly about £30,000 on its own. Now, the FTSE 100 sounds like it's the UK, which I mean, technically it is, but generally the companies in the FTSE 100 tend to do the business not just solely in the UK, which doesn't really make them a true representation of how the UK is performing. But what I see as the issue being with this is that some of the companies within there, I mean, technically, most of them tend to be very slow moving companies. It's not full of big growth companies, which we see in America, like the likes of Apple, Nvidia, Google, Microsoft over in the S&P 500. So from that angle, I suppose the growth that we'd see in the FTSE is not as good as what you were going to see elsewhere. It's true though that the FTSE does have good dividend stocks going for it, but at the moment I'm not looking for income, I'm looking for growth in my portfolio. So when you compare the three indexes side by side, you've got the FTSE 100, which over the past 5 years has managed to do, wait for it, minus 3.58%. Compared to the S&P 500, which over the same 5 years has done 61.42%, which actually isn't that bad when you compare it to the FTSE 250, which over the same 5 years has done minus 11%. And remember, that's a much more accurate representation of the companies in the UK, and how they're performing is quite grim. Now, there are different views on how the UK will perform. Some believe the UK is set to improve, but even when we look at Vanguard's prediction, they said for UK investors, UK shares are likely to return 4.6 and 6.6% per year over the next decade, while global shares, ex-UK and unhedged, will return between 6.1% and 8.1%. Which makes it a bit of a no-brainer not to go for the UK. In my view, with the state of prices going up and mortgage rates going through the roof, mortgage approvals are way down, I can't really see how the UK is in a good position for growth. Sure, inflation may come under control, but where is the money coming from that is going to grow the country's wealth? And I know this is quite a controversial opinion, but I always think when you look at what they've done in Dubai, for example, they invited companies over and they paid zero tax. They invested into the country and they employed people, and all that tax goes back into the country. So their economy is booming, and they've now introduced a 9% tax, which you think, wow, that's still low, and they'll never bat an eyelid at 9% when other countries are so much more expensive. But actually, when you think 9% of that wealth compared to 50% tax of not very much, seems to be a much better way to go in my opinion. In our country, there's a view we want to tax people with money as much as possible. But unfortunately, that doesn't really drive growth, and it's not great for the stock market. As much as people's view maybe should be keep the company in the UK and pay 70 or 80% tax, it's really not going to happen. And I also think that perhaps the next government that gets in is going to be focusing on taxing these big companies, which is good in some ways, but it's not great for growth and the stock market. So I'm not convinced in the direction it's going to go, unfortunately. But feel free to share your opinions and try and convince me. Of course, the debate on what the UK is going to do is quite controversial. And of course, looking at stats in the past, how things have performed doesn't dictate what's going to happen in the next 5 years. But the question is, when I ask myself deep inside and look at how it's performed in the past and think, well, if I would have had money in the S&P 500, it would have done better. It makes me think, am I willing to bet my retirement that the UK is going to perform and come up with this kind of growth? And the truth is, I don't think I do have faith in it. At least not to the extent where I'm willing to risk my future retirement on whether the UK is going to grow. So for this reason, I've decided not to put all of my eggs in one basket. And personally, if I had to ask myself, do I see the growth coming from UK companies? For example, do I see the likes of Taylor Wimpey outperforming, say, Microsoft in the next 30 years? I'm not so sure. Now, I do think tech stocks are pretty overrated and very overpriced, and maybe the US will have a big fall, who knows, but there's no denying that in the past it has always come up eventually, except for a few key periods of time. So a much safer approach would be to go for a World Index Fund, which still gives me 60% exposure to the US, but it also gives me exposure to different countries, in case it doesn't quite pan out. I'm not putting all of my eggs into the one UK basket. Now, the problem is, while that's all good and well, I do really enjoy buying stocks. I think the fun of owning a company, researching the news, seeing if it can go up and trying to make a profit is really entertaining. But you reach this point where it's like, how many mistakes can I afford? A prime example is when I bought the Russian ETF and I lost, what, £20,000. That's blown my potential profit out for the year. So if I keep doing that, when we compare it on a compound interest scale, just 1 or 2 years makes a huge difference to my overall outcome. Here's a couple of examples. If I messed up for 2, 5 or 10 years, it's going to make a huge chunk into my future profits. At the end of August, I'm actually going to be turning 34. So I've kind of spent a period of my life having fun and trying things, and now I've got to the stage where it's like, oh, okay, for the next 20 years I need to get solid returns or I'm not going to hit the numbers I want to retire early. So I need the remainder of my 30s and maybe into my 40s to just be super reliable, where I can funnel as much money into my account as possible while it compounds. I definitely can't afford any more Russian wars. But what's also interesting is how safe you want to be, and this has been something that's been playing on my mind a lot. For example, when I was younger, you would say the S&P 500 is the safest investment you can make. Warren Buffett recommends it and says everyone would be just as well buying the S&P 500. But you also have a lot of people who say the S&P 500 is too high, it's going to go bust and go down. And that kind of makes you think, oh well, maybe the S&P 500 isn't so safe. And let's go for a world index fund, and actually it does become very difficult. And I think you have to think of what level of safety do I want. I don't really know how for some reason the S&P 500 has become to be seen as a scary, risky option, when in reality we have an AI tech-driven future, new technology-driven foods, solar power, and all these crazy kind of future developments. And there's a very high likelihood that the chunk of them will be driven by the US. So for me, it's about risk to reward ratio, and I need reliability going to the next 10, 20, or maybe even 30 years. The next reason I decided to make this move was really authenticity. When I first started this channel, it was all about me showing you everything I've got, exactly what I'm buying and selling, in a transparent way, which at the time I felt that nobody else was doing. And while that's still completely my goal and what I want to do here, it did seem a little bit weird, because in some ways for a lot of my portfolio I'm buying individual stocks. Of course I did have that FTSE fund too, But if you were to come up to me in the street and ask me how to invest, I will tell you to buy a world index fund, invest every month, set and forget, and off you go. So it's kind of like I want to start practicing what I preach. So if I'm able to buy an index fund, keep investing and building up my portfolio, then by the time I retire, I can have that great amount, and I can also show you guys exactly how I'm doing it step by step, so it's a more authentic to the actual process. I think there's nothing worse than recommending one thing than kind of doing another thing. And while I don't think what I was doing was particularly wrong in any way, I mean, that is one way to invest. Personally, I think index funds are much safer and what I would recommend to everyone. So I've taken a huge step and I've decided to move my portfolio to, again, the platform I recommend to everybody, which of course is Invest Engine. I want to be using the platform that I tell other people to use. It's no good me recommending Invest Engine and then you see my portfolio over on Freetrade and you're wondering why I'm using one and recommending another. It's just no good. And of course then you start thinking, well, he's only recommending that because they're paying him, which just isn't the case. The reason I've taken so long in doing this, I mean, ideally I would have liked to do it at the start of the ISA season, is because I've had that Russian ETF that I've not been able to sell. So what actually happened is essentially it became delisted in my portfolio. Delisted is not good, by the way. So it was still showing the value, which hopefully one day it will get listed again and I can sell and hopefully redeem some of that money. But honestly, that's going to take time and it was just stuck in my ISA portfolio. But now what Freetrade have had to do is move it into my general investment account. This is because it's delisted and it can't legally stay within an ISA. So now that's moved into my personal account, I was free to sell my stocks and start moving my ISA. Now I have to admit, I did make one major mistake here, which I hold my hands up to. When I decided to transfer my portfolio, I actually transferred it all across as cash because essentially that's what I wanted to do because I'm going from stocks over to ETFs and I wanted to start fresh. The issue with this is the FSCS, or the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, actually only covers you up to £85,000, but I was transferring over 100,000 in cash. So now I'm not saying this is going to happen, but for example, if Freetrade and Invest Engine both magically went bust in the same time period, I wouldn't be covered for the full amount, which is quite scary. So I was essentially leaving myself vulnerable. So just be aware if you do decide to transfer, make sure you can either do it in chunks or stay under that limit. Hopefully you won't have the same problem, but it's definitely worth bearing in mind, just in case the worst does happen. So my portfolio is now over in Invest Engine as cash. I would like to set it over for the next couple of days, so I'd really like to hear what you guys would do with the cash. I'll be investing roughly £116,000. The two questions I would really like to know: one, would you lump sum it or split it up? Or would you go for a world fund or the S&P 500? I'd be really interested to know and I will take your guys' comments on board. And lastly, I would like to just say sorry if this video does disappoint anyone. I know some of you love the fact that I have these UK stocks, but I need to do what's right for me and I hope this is understandable. As always guys, stay safe and I'll catch you in the next video.